When my grandmother bought her little house nearly 40 years ago, it was the proudest day of her life. She worked 2 jobs as a school cafeteria cook and a seamstress, saved every dime she could, and finally bought herself a modest home where she could grow old with dignity. For decades, she lived quietly, tending her roses in the front yard, waving to neighbors, and baking pies for the local church bake sale. Her house wasn't fancy, but it was hers, free and clear, with every mortgage payment long behind her. She thought her golden years would be peaceful. But she never imagined that one day a knock on the door would threaten to take everything away. It started on a Tuesday afternoon. A man in a suit showed up with a clipboard and a badge that wasn't quite official. He told her he was a representative from the Homeowners Association. Now, my grandmother had lived in her neighborhood for decades, and never once had she heard of any HOA. This wasn't a gated community. There was no clubhouse, no swimming pool, nothing like that. Just a row of older homes on a quiet street. But the man insisted there had always been an HOA, and he claimed my grandmother owed thousands of dollars in fees. He said if she didn't pay up immediately, they would put a lien on her home and eventually evict her. She was terrified. Imagine being nearly 80 years old, living on a fixed income, and suddenly being told you might lose the house you spent your whole life working for. She called me in tears, barely able to get the words out. She said, "They're going to take my home, and I don't know what to do." Now, what this man didn't know was that her grandson, me, happened to be a federal prosecutor. And when I heard her story, every instinct told me something wasn't right. I asked her to describe the man, the documents he handed her, and the so-called HOA rules he claimed she had broken. He said her roses were too tall, her fence needed painting, and she had parked her car in the wrong place. These were laughable excuses, but the paperwork he gave her looked surprisingly real, complete with legal language, fines, and threats of foreclosure. I told her to sit tight, not to pay a dime, and to give me every document she had received. That night, I went through every page carefully, and the deeper I read, the angrier I became. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a clerical error. This was a scam. These people had fabricated an entire homeowners association out of thin air, complete with fake bylaws, official-looking letterheads, and even bogus attorneys' names. Their plan was simple: target elderly homeowners, intimidate them with fake legal threats, and trick them into paying thousands of dollars in fees that didn't exist. And worst of all, they were betting that most victims would be too scared, too confused, or too powerless to fight back. But they picked the wrong grandmother. The next morning, I paid a visit to their so-called office address listed on the documents. It was nothing more than a P.O. box inside a strip mall postal center. That told me everything I needed to know. This was a fly-by-night operation, and they weren't expecting someone with legal training to push back. I began pulling every public record I could find. There was no HOA ever registered in that neighborhood, no record with the state, nothing filed with the county clerk's office. These people had literally invented it out of nowhere. I filed a complaint immediately with the local district attorney's office, and at the same time, I notified federal authorities because this scam crossed state lines. The group had been mailing threats from different locations, trying to cover their tracks. I also made sure to put a fraud alert on my grandmother's property records so no one could sneak in and try to file a fraudulent lien. When I told my grandmother what was really going on, she cried with relief. She had been so frightened she could barely sleep. She kept imagining strangers coming to her door, forcing her out of the home she had poured her life into. I promised her that would never happen, not while I was breathing. But here's where things got even darker. As I dug deeper, I discovered that my grandmother wasn't the only victim. At least a dozen elderly homeowners in her area had received the same threatening letters. Some of them had already paid thousands of dollars because they didn't know what else to do. One man, a retired veteran, had drained his savings account trying to settle what he thought were real HOA dues. Another widow was on the verge of selling her car to make the payments. The scam was working because fear is powerful, especially when you're alone and vulnerable. That made my mission crystal clear. It wasn't just about saving my grandmother's home. It was about stopping these criminals before they destroyed even more lives. I coordinated with law enforcement to set up a sting operation. We arranged for undercover agents to pose as homeowners willing to pay cash just to see who would show up to collect. And sure enough, the same man with the clipboard arrived, smug and confident, thinking he was about to pocket easy money. What he didn't realize was that he had just walked into a trap. When he was confronted by officers, the look on his face said it all. Shock, fear, and then desperation. He tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that he was just a messenger, but the evidence told a very different story. Every letter, every fraudulent document, every threatening phone call led back to him and his partners. The entire fake HOA scheme unraveled right there. I'll never forget calling my grandmother that night to tell her the news. For the first time in weeks, her voice was calm and steady. She said, "I knew you'd protect me. I knew you wouldn't let them win." And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just about stopping a scam. It was about showing my grandmother and every other senior out there that they are not alone, that someone will stand up for them when predators come knocking. But the fight wasn't over yet. What we uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. There were more people involved, more victims spread across different states, and a bigger conspiracy than we first imagined. And as a prosecutor, I wasn't going to rest until every last one of them was held accountable. The next morning, my grandmother called me again, her voice trembling. She said 2 men had shown up at her front door with clipboards, insisting she had violated multiple neighborhood rules, including keeping her rose bushes too tall and having an unapproved paint color on her front door. My grandmother has lived in that house for 35 years, and that door has been the same warm blue since my grandfather painted it. She told them this, but they waved their papers in her face and threatened her with fines. When she asked for their official identification, they only flashed cheap badges that looked like they were printed at home. My blood boiled as she described their arrogance. These people thought they could intimidate a 75-year-old woman into submission. They thought they had found an easy target, someone they could bully into handing over money or even her home. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I told her to stay calm and not sign a single document. I immediately drove over, and as soon as I walked up her driveway, the 2 so-called HOA officers were still there. They looked surprised to see me, and even more surprised when I introduced myself as a federal prosecutor. The smugness drained from their faces, but they quickly recovered and tried to sound official. They shoved their violation notices into my hands, papers filled with legal jargon but full of inconsistencies. I noticed immediately that the letterhead didn't match any registered HOA in the county, the signatures were forged, and the supposed citations referred to rules that didn't exist. This wasn't just shady, it was fraud, plain and simple. I told them I'd need the name of their supervising officer, their official HOA registration number, and the bylaws they claimed to enforce. Instead of answering, they exchanged nervous glances and said I'd hear from their lawyers soon. Then they walked away quickly, trying to appear in control, but I could see the panic in their eyes. My grandmother watched all of this from the porch, clutching her hands nervously. I reassured her right then and there that she had nothing to worry about, because I wasn't going to let anyone push her out of her own home. Later that day, I started digging. I contacted the county clerk's office to confirm whether this HOA was registered. As I suspected, it didn't exist in any official capacity. Next, I searched property records to see if any entity had authority over her subdivision. Again, nothing. This meant these people had fabricated an entire Homeowners Association, complete with fake officers, fake documents, and fake enforcement rules, all to scam elderly residents. I began to wonder how many other vulnerable neighbors had been harassed, threatened, or even extorted into paying bogus fines. The thought made me furious. That evening, my grandmother received another letter slipped under her door. This one was even more aggressive, stating that she had 48 hours to vacate the property or face immediate legal action. The letter was signed by someone claiming to be the president of the HOA, but again, the name didn't appear anywhere in public records. They underestimated my grandmother, and they underestimated me. What they didn't know was that I had already contacted local law enforcement, and I was preparing to involve the FBI, since mail fraud and interstate wire fraud might be involved if they used postal services or electronic communications in their scam. I decided to set a trap. I called the phone number listed on the letter, pretending to be an ordinary family member who didn't know the law. A man answered with a rehearsed, authoritative tone, telling me the only way to avoid eviction was to pay the fines immediately. He even demanded a wire transfer to an account that sounded suspiciously personal, not tied to any organization. I played along just enough to keep him talking, recording the conversation and gathering every detail I could. When he slipped and mentioned other cases in the neighborhood, my suspicions were confirmed. They were targeting more than just my grandmother. The following day, I visited a few of my grandmother's neighbors, especially the elderly ones. Sure enough, several of them had received similar letters. One couple even admitted to paying a fine of $500 because they were terrified of losing their home. That broke my heart and fueled my determination. These con artists weren't just playing games, they were robbing hard-working retirees of their peace, dignity, and savings. It became personal. I gathered all the evidence: fake notices recorded, phone calls, forged signatures, even the money trail from that wire transfer account. With everything in hand, I called a meeting with the neighbors, explaining exactly what was happening and assuring them that no legitimate authority was behind these threats. I could see the relief in their eyes, but also the lingering fear. They had been made to feel powerless, and that's exactly what predators like this count on. Not this time. Not in my grandmother's neighborhood. The next move had to be precise. I contacted federal authorities to coordinate a sting. If these criminals were bold enough to create a fake HOA, they were bold enough to show up again to collect money. I needed them to incriminate themselves further. With cooperation from the police, we arranged surveillance around my grandmother's home. Cameras were installed discreetly, and officers were nearby but out of sight. My grandmother, brave as ever, agreed to play along if they showed up again. She told me, "They think I'm weak, but I've got you in my corner." I'll never forget the determination in her voice. 2 days later, like clockwork, the same men returned, demanding payment of final fees before eviction proceedings would begin. But this time, they walked straight into a trap. I confronted them again, this time with uniformed officers stepping out from the shadows. The men stammered, tried to backtrack, and even attempted to run, but they didn't get far. In moments, they were handcuffed, their fake badges confiscated, and their scam exposed. But the fight wasn't over yet. The arrest was only the beginning. My job as a prosecutor meant building a solid case, ensuring these fraudsters faced justice, not just a slap on the wrist. As we processed their files and accounts, we discovered an entire network behind them, people who had been running similar scams in multiple neighborhoods, often preying on the elderly who lived alone. What they didn't expect was that they'd finally picked the wrong target. The courtroom air felt heavy, as if everyone present knew this was more than just a case about a fake Homeowners Association. It was a battle over dignity, justice, and the way vulnerable people like my grandmother could so easily be preyed upon. The opposing side sat stiffly, their attorney clearly trying to project confidence, but every time I caught the eye of the man who had signed those fraudulent eviction notices, I saw him flinch ever so slightly. He had thought he was untouchable. He had thought that an old woman living quietly in her home would never fight back, much less have someone like me standing in her corner. He never expected the courtroom spotlight to shine on his greed and deception. I began my opening statement slowly, letting the silence stretch so that every ear leaned in. I told the jury this wasn't just about money or property lines. This was about power, about people who thought they could fabricate rules and weaponize fear to force hard-working citizens, especially the elderly, out of the homes they had built their lives in. I spoke of my grandmother, of her years of devotion to the community, of how she had raised a family and kept her home with pride. And then I contrasted that with the cold, calculated scheme of these so-called enforcers who didn't even have a legitimate HOA to stand on. By the time I was done, I could feel the room was with me, but the other side didn't go down without a fight. They presented their documents, their bylaws, their notices filled with legal jargon meant to intimidate. They even tried to frame my grandmother as negligent, as someone who failed to comply with made-up standards. The arrogance in their tone boiled my blood, but I stayed calm, knowing that every lie they told was another thread I could unravel. Piece by piece, I dismantled their story. The documents they produced had mismatched signatures, dates that didn't line up, and stamps that belonged to organizations that didn't even exist. What they had built looked sturdy from a distance, but under pressure, it collapsed like a house of cards. The most powerful moment came when I called my grandmother to the stand. She was nervous, of course, her hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone, but her voice, though soft, carried a strength that silenced the room. She told her story of living in the house for decades, of never once signing on to an HOA, of the sleepless nights when strangers banged on her door demanding payments she didn't owe. Her voice cracked when she said she thought she would lose the only home she had ever known. And when she looked at the jury and whispered, "I just wanted to live in peace," I saw several of them blink back tears. In that moment, the case stopped being about documents and technicalities. It became human. It became about protecting someone's right to live without fear of being bullied out of their own home. That was the hook I had been waiting for, and I knew the jury felt it too. When the defense tried to cross-examine her, they made the fatal mistake of pushing too hard. They questioned her memory, tried to trip her up on dates, and even implied that she had imagined some of the harassment. That was their undoing. Because the jury didn't see a confused elderly woman, they saw someone being bullied right there in front of them, live in court. And nothing unites people faster than seeing injustice play out before their eyes. After days of testimony, the closing arguments arrived. I reminded the jury that if we allowed people to invent authority, to terrorize homeowners with threats and false claims, then no one's home would be safe. I said, "Today it's my grandmother, but tomorrow it could be your parents, your neighbor, or even you. If we do not stand against this, we allow lawlessness to dress itself as law." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of fraud, extortion, and harassment. The so-called HOA was ordered to pay damages, and the individuals behind it were barred from ever attempting such schemes again. My grandmother would not only keep her home, but she would receive compensation for the stress, the threats, and the emotional toll they had inflicted. When the judge read the verdict, my grandmother squeezed my hand so tightly I could feel her strength, a strength that had never left her even through all the fear. The courtroom erupted in relief and quiet. Applause, though the judge quickly hushed it. But the message was clear. Justice had won. Walking out of that courthouse, I looked at my grandmother and saw the weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't just keeping her home, she was reclaiming her peace. The neighbors gathered around, some crying, some cheering, and I realized this wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for every homeowner who had ever been pushed, threatened, or scammed by people pretending to hold power. Since then, I've dedicated part of my work to making sure scams like this don't succeed again. I've spoken at community meetings, helped set up workshops to educate seniors about their rights, and shared my grandmother's story so others know they're not alone. Because if there's one thing this taught me, it's that silence is what gives scammers power. The moment we shine a light on them, their schemes fall apart. So, if you ever face something like this, know that you don't have to back down. Know that laws exist to protect you, and people will stand by you if you speak up. My grandmother almost lost everything because she thought she was powerless. But when she fought back, she discovered just how strong she really was. And to those who prey on the vulnerable, who think they can intimidate and manipulate for profit, this case is a warning. The law is watching, and sooner or later justice will catch up with you. This is the story of how one woman's quiet courage, backed by the law, toppled a fake empire built on lies. And it's proof that no matter how small you feel, no matter how loud the threats may be, truth and justice will always have the final word.